Hello, I'm Dapper Dan Gavoston, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals, and the one that's upcoming I've already got pre-ordered, which I say definitely count.
And I'm Mischievous Marcinacchio, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals, which I have to say, when I got my weekly comic list from my local comic book shop, I had to ask, are you going to pull the annual? Because, you know, a lot of people don't count the annuals as part of your subscription for Amazing Spider-Man, and I'm yet to hear the answer. So we'll see, you know, when it pulls and when I get it. I mean, I'll get it, but, you know, this whole thing makes me question if they even count, Dan. So they don't count.
I mean, to your credit, Mark, the annuals were a separate subscription at my shop.
Yeah.
So,
you know what else is a separate subscription, Dan? Every other comic book series besides Amazing Spider-Man, and yet we don't count those comic books, and yet you count this.
Well,
series.
So here's the real question: Superior Spider-Man back in the day was a separate subscription than Amazing Spider-Man at my shop. And yet, somehow it got folded into legacy numbering. And, you know, I know just saying that Superior Spider-Man is included in legacy numbering is enough to, like, blow some of the minds of some of our listeners that are really hardcore into that numbering stuff.
I know.
And I really just don't care.
Well, now you're just pointing out the fallacy of Marvel. But continue, Dan. Go.
No, that's really all I wanted to say. Like, the question is, like, does Superior count then?
We've exhausted this argument, Dan. Why don't you continue with the show before people?
All right. Well, welcome everyone. That's it. That's the end of this intro for the show. Mark has called it dead. Well, anyway, welcome to the Amazing Spider Talk, the show where two fans and collectors uncover the strange, fun, and fascinating history of the Spider-Man comic universe. And if you're interested in that annual stuff, oh boy, have we got a show for you. Thanks for joining us for this review episode of the Amazing Spider Talk.
Talk about fascinating. Well, if you want to swing along with us on our journey through Spidey's past, present, and future, and subscriber numbers, subscribe to Amazing Spider Talk on your favorite podcast app and leave us a review to help spread the word about our show.
Yeah, we haven't gotten a review in a while. We'd love to get some more of those. So if you could fire up your Apple Podcast, it does help bump us up in the ratings. Anyway, this podcast exists because of the support of our Patreon members. If you want to receive early episodes, exclusive artwork, and keep this podcast going, go to AmazingSpiderTalk.com and consider joining our Patreon. Today on the show, Mark and I are going to be discussing Amazing Spider-Man Volume 6, number 30. This issue was written by Zeb Wells. The cover pencils and interior pencils are by Ed McGuinness, inks by Mark Farmer, colors by Marcio Menyz, and of course, letters by VC's Joe Caramanga. This issue was first released on July 26th, 2023. Mark, why don't you take us through all the events that happened in Amazing Spider-Man Volume 6, number 30?
Absolutely, Dan. Thank you very much. Well, we open with a smug-looking Otto and a totally ripped Norman Osborn in the post-serum injection afterglow. Norman starts giggling.
We all know that one.
We all know that one. Norman starts giggling maniacally, warning Otto that he should have listened to him because even though he got enough serum in him to quote-unquote turn an elephant, Norman was all like, skidamarinky-dinky-dink, skidamarinky-doo, I already have a bunch of serum in me, and that's not what makes me the Green Goblin, you buffoon. If you get that reference, Dan, I give you a Gen X cookie, okay? Anyway.
Oh, yeah, I did get that reference, Mark,
okay.
But I will say this does beg the question, like, what does the green elephant look like? Like, is there a super-powered elephant out there that's been turned? Has Norman, like, tested this on elephants?
I don't know. Anyway, Otto does not take kindly to being called a buffoon, so now he's done showing Norman some mercy. And that brings us to Spider-Man and the tentacles, along with Jonah, and Spidey is definitely liking this octopus fusion thing a bit too much. He calls Jonah a dope, and the horror of that makes him shut his mouth. Back to Otto and Norman is now going for the kill, but not before admitting that Osborn actually outsmarted him. That's when Spider-Man shows up, and Otto is ready to throw down, except his Octoids are not totally listening to him. Hate when that happens. That's when Otto discovers that Spider-Man spine-locked with his arms, and boy is he unhappy about that. Spidey tells him, the die is cast, and each calls the other adult, and McGuinness says, "Sure, I'll fashion a fun double-page spread." So Spidey and Otto throw hands, and Spidey warns him that without his tentacles, he's got nothing. But Otto was never one to concede an inch, so instead Spider-Man is about to, quote-unquote, get harvested by an apex predator. Whew, that is some snappy dialogue. The Octoids grab Spider-Man, and his own arms are telling him to detach and free himself, but Spider-Man is not willing to let the arms sacrifice themselves. Just as things are at their bleakest, Norman Osborn saves the day, and the 2-on-1 fight is just too much for Otto to overcome. Just before Spider-Man can do something he regrets with Otto's arms, like kill Otto, Norman stops him and helps him detach from the harness. Otto makes his great escape, and Peter lets the arms know that they've broken up. We end with Peter and Norman sharing a moment, reflecting on Kamala Khan and her friendship, including Kamala ordering a large coffee with extra serum, which even the text of the comic admits is a terrible joke. I mean, I'm not saying any character deserves to die based on a joke, but whew. We fade to black with some subtext that maybe this friendship with Peter and Osborn is for real. Go figure. Happy, happy friendship. I'm not looking at solicitations, Dan. And that's my recap of this comic.
This one's going to last forever. You know, to start off our conversation on this, I think it's like appropriate to like look at this story in its entirety and where it falls in this run. And, you know, I'm sure over time that our opinion on this will change. But like one of the things that I was most surprised with finishing off this story, you know, especially based on where it started, where I thought, okay, we're kind of getting a frivolous Dr. Octopus story. And by the end, I thought that this really became, you know, a pretty poignant issue that, while I wish it had kind of done more with Otto in the end, and we can talk about that later, I thought really did a great job of continuing the thematics that have been, you know, central to this run. But, you know, the idea of like what friendship means, what good and evil mean, and, you know, can anybody truly be redeemed while their sins or their history is behind them, be it Peter Parker or Norman Osborn, or even in this case, Otto Octavius. And I found this a really satisfying story. I don't think it's my favorite of the run. I think the Tombstone story, you know, still leads the pack in that regard. But boy, was I surprised by how much this thing really won me over in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm like kind of judging on a curve here or something, because it does feel like a lot of my pleasant feelings about this story are tied up in in the fact that I was not expecting to enjoy it all that much. You know,
Yeah.
But all the same, I mean, like, yeah, I just found this from a character standpoint, you know, at least in terms of the protagonist of the story, which, like it or not, are Peter and Norman, and, you know, I feel like both are getting good shine throughout this storyline. You know, it's effective in that regard. And, yeah, I mean, we can absolutely talk about the Otto Octavius of it all and kind of where that's headed. But in terms of the Norman stuff, I mean, like, and I know we'll talk more about him in a bit, but, like, frankly, this is the kind of setup and context with the Peter dynamic that I think maybe some prior storylines could have benefited from, to make those stakes seem higher and those outcomes feel more emotionally heavy. Because, I mean, you know, not to jump all the way to the end, but like the moment they shared with Kamala at the end, I think was kind of the first time I actually, as a reader, felt a little pang of emotion about what happened in that earlier storyline with her. And I think part of that is due to the fact of how they kind of set up the dynamic with Peter and Norman over these 4 issues.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, like, I'm really glad that this story was as short as it was. You know, like, I think that this kind of pacing that we've been getting throughout the Zeb Wells run has been really solid. Just getting these little micro stories, like, you know, I guess the longest ones have been 6 issues, but that's been the odd duck out, you know, here. And you know, if you don't like something, you're moving on pretty quickly. It's not as fast to say like Brand New Day was, but I like these really condensed stories that have a real point to them. I do think that there is some repetition starting to really settle in here. You know, talk about Norman Osborn's role in this. But you know, before we move on to that, I did want to say I agree with you on the Kamala stuff. I do wish that the thing that Norman describes happened on page rather than through his, you know, post description. But the writing is strong enough that it still was able to work, I guess, as effectively as anything written on a page might, without seeing it actually play out. You know, and
I mean, I was just say it's as effective as anything related to Kamala Khan at Oscorp and her death at the hands of Rabin has been so far. I mean, again, maybe this is a curve, but it's effective in that relative state, if you will.
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to mention, and I said Otto's name earlier, and I don't have a ton to say about him here, except that I really like how he was written, you know, throughout this. I still don't necessarily love the living arms as pets kind of thing, but there's enough silliness with it that it won me over. There's a moment with an Octoid shaking his little fist as Otto is being shepherded away that made me laugh. And so at a certain point, the charm wins you over to the idea, you know, even if it is completely antithetical to, you know, how you might view a character. But the thing that I find frustrating is that, you know, it seems like we didn't really land anywhere new for Otto by the end of the story. Like, he brings up a lot of really interesting things about his character, going to get revenge on Norman, you know, for what happened during Superior and his, you know, loss of memories and stuff. And I can't help but feel like Wells isn't being allowed to conclude that, or at the very least, he's just introducing this stuff to be a team player because he's got to set up Dan Slott's Superior run that he's about to kick off. And yeah, I'm going to get that story in another comic, but honestly, I want to see what Wells has to say about this because he's doing such a good job of it in Amazing Spider-Man that it's a little bit of a bummer to not see him be allowed to finish that out, you know. And, it's Dan Slott's creation, blah, 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 blah. But I do think it does begin to hollow out this run a little bit when everything gets followed up somewhere else, be it, you know, the Queen Goblin, or even the Hobgoblin is now in Miles's book, you know, and that's been really cool, and I'm loving seeing that. And it's a great example of synergy between these titles. But I kind of want to just see Wells get a little more ownership over this, you know, universe. It feels like he's playing for other people sometimes rather than for himself.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that. I mean, but at the same time, you know, Wells is the one who killed Miss Marvel in his book, so I guess it kind of goes around.
So he's so lucky.
I know. He drew the long straw there. No, I mean, I agree 100%. With what you're saying, I guess the one little bit of devil's advocate that I'll play here is, and it's not even necessarily a contrary point of view, but I think part of what made this entire storyline work for me was, at the end of the day, it was just kind of in its own 2023 kind of a way, just a normal Spider-Man story with no gimmicks or shocks or mysteries or magic boxes or MacGuffins or anything like that. It was just a story. And, you know, grading it on the scale of it just being a story, it really worked. And, you know, I wonder if it would have worked all the same if we did get too much backstory into, well, what's Otto up to now? And you know, how is this going to transition to this new Superior status quo? And, you know, I don't know. I mean, do you hear what I'm saying? I mean, does this make sense to you? I mean,
I 100% do. I guess my feeling is just like the end of this for Otto is more of an ellipsis than like a period. And I know we're not ever going to get periods in comics, right?
Right.
But like it, this story was so interested in like Otto's status quo, as an antagonist, to then not really land anywhere with him kind of being shepherded out the back door. It felt like I kind of wanted to go like, oh, cool, like that's what this meant to Otto within this chapter, because we get it for Peter, we get it for Norman.
Yeah.
It feels like a substantial chapter for them, but not for Otto Octavius, because I feel like it's coming else in someone else's book. And like at the same time, you're right. Like I totally get it. Like that's what it means to be the lead writer of Amazing Spider-Man in 2023, and the person who can be the best team player is probably the best person for the book.
Right.
Because it is a line. It's not just a title. So, like, in that regard, I think he's doing a really good job of finding his own, like, it's Peter and Norman are the main characters of the story.
Right.
And Otto gets a meaningful contribution. So I think he's doing a good job. But as someone who like really loves the primacy of Amazing Spider-Man and how that book has been treated historically, a character like Otto, I would love to have seen Amazing Spider-Man come down with like a definitive statement on who this guy is now.
Yeah. I mean, again, not to belabor this point too much, we can move on after this, but I would just say like, I guess for me, it kind of just reminded me of just some random Stan Lee, John Romita Sr. Spider-Man Dr. Octopus arc from the late 1960s. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, if we're moving Peter and Norman forward, since they're the ones driving this narrative, I kind of feel like a happy camper. And the spoiled 21st century comic book reader and critic in me wants more from everything, but I think if I want to just kind of keep this as simple as possible, it works on those terms.
I do want to say, though, I think that this issue was a few pages shorter than a standard issue. I think it's only 18 pages instead of 21. So, like, that's curious in its own right. At least they didn't charge us $4.99 for it, which seems to be the new standard for Marvel Comics.
Right,
So, anyway, let's talk about Norman Osborn and his, like, riding the line between good and evil.
Right.
We discussed last time whether or not this was it for him. Like, was he going to flip back? And, obviously the book revels in saying no to that at the beginning. What'd you think about his characterization in this issue?
Again, I mean, it's within the context of what they've been building. I thought it was good. I do think, and you kind of alluded to this, earlier in our review, that there is some repetition going on here. You know what I mean? Like I feel like we're getting some beats that we've seen before, and we're how far is Norman going to go? And like you said, is this going to be it? Is this the end of good old Normie Osborn? Oh wait, no, he wiggled his way out of this one, and he's still good. I mean, we are getting to a point where I feel like we kind of have to either pull the trigger on this or stop baiting it, because like, how much suspense do you think you're pulling here? I don't know. All the same, I enjoyed the moments, and like, I feel like this storyline, for lack of a better phrase, is the most genuine Norman has seen within the status quo, which probably means they're gonna pull the rug out from under us very soon. but like, now I'm like almost like, I'm ready to accept this. Like, let's just do this, But like, that's not how it's gonna obviously be. So.
Yeah, I think for me the repetition is like really in the format of these things, which is like Norman always coming in for the save at the end, and I just think, like, we've criticized that the other hero saving Spider-Man, ad nauseum during, Dan Slott's volume 3 of the title, where it seemed like every issue Spider-Man was proven to be a fool needing to be saved by someone else. Here, I think it's a lot more genuine. Like, Peter really has a moment where he could easily sacrifice the arms, but he chooses to potentially endanger himself to save another person, I guess, if you want to call it a person. And Norman then comes in for the save. I just kind of feel like that beat has happened repeatedly.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I'm a little bit unsure of, and maybe I'm misreading this, but like the resolution to last issue's plot twist is that like he already has all of this goblin serum inside of him, which isn't really anything shocking. In fact, I brought it up in the previous, podcast that like he's been shown using goblin powers in other books. So like I suspected that it wouldn't impact him. But here he kind of explicitly says, like, hey, I'm good now. My sins are gone. Like, there's no amount of this stuff that's going to make me evil because that's been expunged from me. And, like, I don't know that it's been that explicitly said. And it made me think, like, wait a minute. Did we just, like, take the timer off of this time bomb? Like, he truly is just good, like a good guy now. And even the flashes of him like crunching his phone, in that issue, what feels like forever ago, like a year ago, in like the Hobgoblin arc, I think it was, are like, is that gone? Is that off the table? And if so, does that like remove a lot of the suspense around Norman? I don't know. Did you read it the same way as me?
I don't know if I read it the same way as that. I mean, I read a lot of that interplay between Norman and Otto is kind of bluster, for lack of a better word. You know what I mean? Like I mean, if I guess what I'm saying is, if it was meant to be literal, or if it was meant to be believed, I didn't believe it. You know what I mean? Like, okay. Because of the earlier context you just talked about. But if I'm gonna no prize myself for this, I would just say like I kind of read it as like Norman, trying to, demoralize Otto by saying, you can't beat me this way because, I'm good now. And frankly, it does kind of like lead to this, somewhat interesting pontification about good and evil and good and interesting and and evil and uninteresting. So I don't know what you want to say about that. I see an interesting note here where you attribute something that could be quote unquote coming out of my mouth, so I want you to say it.
Oh, sure. I just to put a pin on the previous thing, like I really felt like the title had been playing with this idea of like every time Norman comes in for a save, if he's involved in something violent, it moves him closer towards regaining his goblin status, right? Like there's the bit where he beats the pulp out of the hobgoblin, and like every punch I think is meant to be read as like, oh shoot, like what's emerging here.
Right.
And here I don't feel like that tension exists, like, and so like that's what I'm wondering is like, hey, did we forget about that? Is that just not how this works anymore? And so like this is more me just kind of charting like, well, okay, what am I actually like reading about this in regards to like how this works, this transformation. So anyway, I did want to talk about the monologue at the end because I think, yes, I would have rather have seen it on the page and maybe then reflected it here. But I did find it genuinely moving and added an emotional weight to Kamala's death that I don't think was there before, and is probably too late to fully resonate now that we know that she's coming back in the pages of X-Men. In fact, I think this week she came back in the Hellfire Gala issue. So it's like, okay, I'll play the world's smallest violin for that.
That's a land speed record, I think, for
yeah, no, really, you're not kidding.
I haven't even read Death of a Friend yet, and she's back.
Fallen Friend.
It's on my pile still. Anyway.
Yeah, well, it is a land speed record. I guess they're like, we got to get it for this movie soon.
Yeah.
So, but you're right. There was a point in this where like Otto earlier in the comic says that like both he and Norman were at their most boring when they're good. But Norman at the end of the book says, no, like we were most interesting, and that good is interesting inherently. Like he used to think that the accumulation of power was what life was about, and here, he realizes like really friendship is a far more rewarding thing than the kind of slow accumulation of power. And he even in the process, I thought he brings Rabin in a way that I thought echoed what you had been saying. You had been saying how like boring and forgettable of a villain Rabin is, and here Norman confirms it. He says, quote, "Nothing he said is worth pondering or repeating," end quote. In opposition to Kamala's mantra about good being a thing you do, and like as soon as he said that on the pages, I was like, that's exactly what Mark said. Like Rabin is utterly forgettable. And whether this is the writer trying...
Norman says he feels he's been attached with a rivet gun. Wait, what?
Yeah. I mean, like, whether that's a writer trying to, like, retroactively, like, change a reading on his book, like, criticism of that issue did not come out when he was writing this, or of that character. And so, maybe that's not the most interesting way to write comics, but, like, it is an interesting bit of observation, I think, that, like... that guy in his accumulation of power and being evil is utterly uninteresting compared to the characters that like we cheer on and get involved in their friendships. I don't know, Mark. Did you feel any kinship to that statement? That am I falsely attributing that to your to coming out of your mouth?
No, I mean I always have to take credit when things that even I didn't say, but just my general demeanor kind of put into the universe when it comes to our comics. But no, I really enjoyed the kind of pontificationing, if you will, during this sequence. We can certainly quibble over the Kamala Khan of it all, because it's still kind of hard to say. It's still kind of hard to redeem what they did with that, and I don't know if they will. I don't, I know we're not necessarily judging them for that right here, but yeah, it's. I don't know if it's that evil is uninteresting, because like there has certainly been some very interesting evil characters in Spider-Man comics, but yeah, I do think that there is kind of there is a template for an evil character who is just and if they wanted to quote me, I think the way I would refer to it on the podcast is twirling their mustache evil. Which I always find to me that's boring evil, because if it's just so rote and predictable and one dimensional, then yeah, it's a boring evil. But I think I've been saying on this show from the get-go that if a creator truly wants to explore good Norman Osborn, there could be some really interesting stuff that comes out of that. And I think we're seeing that to a degree here if you just kind of open your mind to it.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I especially like the point that Norman makes here, how like Kamala brought down Rabin's plan by saving one life. And like that evil doesn't have the power, as much power as the power of friendship. I mean, it's corny, right? Like, whatever, the superpowers were the friends we made along the way, whatever you want to say. Yeah. But it felt, like genuine to me. I mean, would it have been 100 times more powerful if Kamala's death was earned initially?
Right.
Yeah, it would. It would definitely. Like, this could have been an all-time great ending if I believed at all in the editorial mandate that is Kamala Khan's death. But as a monologue to this story, I thought it was a pretty decent capper.
Long-standing supporting cast member Kamala Khan, may she rest in peace. Do you want to talk about the Slack, Dan, and maybe what they're saying about such storylines and pontifications?
Sure. Take us into the Slack ad, Mark.
We got to transition somehow, Dan. Anyway.
Hey, look, if editorial is going to slap these things together with a rivet gun, I'm going to get some leeway.
There we go. Hundreds of listeners like you hang out in our community of Spider-Man fans on Slack. The amazing Spider Slack community is absolutely free to join, and you can jump into active conversations with awesome people about collecting, conventions, movies, new comics, old comics, and more. Dan, what the heck is happening in the Slack this week?
Mark, you're gonna really need to like give me even more than the monkey toy thing from a few weeks back. Like you're really gonna have to give me some slack here about the Slack. It was brought to my attention recently by a friend of the show, Chris Baker, who talked to us about video games in the past, and has a young child who is watching Spidey and His Amazing Friends, the show for toddlers. And my son is a toddler, I think technically, but is not watching that show. You know, I'm trying to keep him away from like, you know, images of violence, and I don't really know. It just seems like it's a little too old for him. Okay. He's watching Miss Rachel on YouTube.
Okay.
But it appears that in season 2 of this show, their Gwen Stacy now has a father on the show, George Stacy. And in the show, and I've been researching this all week, Mark.
Okay.
In the show, George Stacy is actually not a cop. His wife is. And she's, you know, still around, I guess. And so George, I guess, is kind of this nerdy guy that helps out Gwen on stuff. Here's the strange thing, Mark. And like, look, I may not be the most cynical person on earth, but like, you know, I'll take something with a grain of salt or whatever. But Chris sent this to me. This character looks identical to me, like incredibly identical. It's not just that he looks like me. He's wearing the exact same outfit that I wear in my social media profile pictures, which is what I got married on my wedding. It's like a blue button-up shirt and a blue jacket. Like, he has the same exact glasses as me. It's the same shape of glasses in that image. That's like all of my profile pictures online. Like, I don't really want to believe it because it seems so bizarre and uncanny. But like, I thought, okay, maybe it's Jason Latour, right? Like, it's the father of Gwen. It's Jason Latour. It doesn't look like Jason Latour. If you were going to make it look like Jason Latour, you wouldn't make it look like this. It looks like me. Like, but even if it isn't me, it approaches a level of like uncanny valley that makes me kind of weird. Like, I don't know. I sent this to you, Mark. Am I blowing this out of proportion, or does it look exactly like me?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you. I was just Googling narcissistic personality disorder. I mean, yeesh, and people think I'm full of myself. My goodness. Dan.
Oh, my God.
My goodness. I mean, what are we going to do with you, Dan Gavasden? I mean, now...
Okay, well, okay. Have me locked up or, like, tell me to run for president. But, like, I can't... I've been looking at this all week, and I'm just like, what do I do with this information? Like, it looks just like me. It is upsetting to some degree. Mark, am I? Does it look like me, or am I absolutely insane?
If I'm being completely impartial, yes, it looks like you. It looks a lot like you. And you know, hey, we had wasn't there a Bendis comic where they talked about the Spider Talk podcast or something, or
yeah, and that's a much looser thing. Like, that's probably not. But like, I tweeted Bendis about it, and he responded and was very like being jokey about it. So it's like, okay, like maybe he did, maybe he didn't, you know. But like, Bendis is having a good time with this. Like, I'll say this: if you are a designer or work on this show, and you can confirm or deny this, I would love to know, because like, I mean, it's one thing like. George Stacy has never looked anything remotely like this. Like, I look nothing like George Stacy, right? So, like, suddenly this image appears, and it's like if you were to create a me from the the Nintendo Wii of me, it would look like this. It is me.
I mean, has Aunt May ever looked like Marissa Tomei? I mean, come on, Dan.
No, that's true.
I mean,
that's true.
If we're gonna do that, Dan, I mean, you know, like you're gonna lose that argument. But anyway.
All right. Well, Mark, I'm glad your cynicism has like brought me to reality. But I would be curious to hear people weigh in, as they have on the Slack, about whether or not this looks like me to you, because like I don't know what to do with this information. I've been looking at it all week with my Facebook profile picture, and I'm like, this is so uncanny, like, you know, and like that's something like I don't think anybody listens to our show, you know, like so yeah, I get to see the actual numbers, so I know how small of an audience we have, you know. So like it's not like to puff myself up in some way. I just looking at this and I'm like, what? Like, what is this? Anyway, Mark, you don't seem to be taking the bait.
I mean, or am I just producing new bait, a different bait? You know, like the world remains to be seen. I mean, you know, we.
I need to get like our look-alike expert Alan Scherstl to weigh in on this, because he has in the past said like characters look like Dan Slott in the pages of Nick Spencer comics, and I don't really agree. But like if that counts, I don't know what this is. So anyway, join in on the fun.
I mean,
and my navel gazing stuff.
Was George Stacy talking about the solicitations 6 months out? That's the
well, I'll tell you, maybe all of these lookouts that I saw conjured this conjured this up. There's a kinship there, you know, forged in kindred over George Stacy. Anyway, come join our amazing Slack. There's a link in the description to this episode that'll let you sign up in less than a minute. And hey, if you work on the show and can confirm or deny it, I would love to hear. I would love to hear, because I don't know what to do with this information at this point, and I think I'm crazy. And Mark is shaking his head like, why did I ever sign up to do a podcast with this guy?
First, he thinks his character looks like him. Then he thinks the creators listen to our show. Dan, where does it end with you, man? All right, let's transition back to our review before I have to get Dan committed for all of these things.
All right. Well, I think the real appeal of an issue like this is seeing Spider-Man in octopus arms. I mean, right? We got the big splash page of it revealed last issue, and I think we were both like, all right, I want to see this in action. And I think the action involving it is great, but the most fun part is like the sort of like psychological elements that are beginning to play into this.
Yeah, at its core level, Dan, it's just fun. You know, like we're having fun with it, and you know, like, yeah, similar to a point you made earlier in the episode about kind of like, are we setting things up for other writers, or even just kind of, you know, leveraging what other writers have done with these characters. I mean, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is like this, you know, once Spider-Man is kind of, you know, locked into the spinal connector or whatever you want to call it, it reads very much like a heightened Dan Slott Superior Spider-Man. But it was fun, and it was a fun callback to those stories, which for the most part were great stories. So like I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the Die is Cast. I enjoyed everyone calling each other adult until, like, you know, they just all got dolted out. You're adult. No, you're adult. You know, how dare you call me adult, you dolt. I mean, it was just fun stuff. It was also like visually arresting stuff. I mean, I know we're going to talk about McGuinness towards the end here, but like everything about these segments worked from a Spider-Man storytelling standpoint. Like, you know, there was nothing about it that made me think that this was going to last any more than this issue. You know, like there was clearly an expiration date. Then again, we said that about Rec Rap, and of course he's back. But the fact is, like, this was done perfectly for what it needed to be, and I loved it.
Yeah, I did too. I laughed throughout. I think the comic pacing here is tremendous. And, you know, this is the kind of reference that I think is really wonderful. It is not like lingering on it for too long. It's making stories in the past still meaningful without like really laying into continuity quite so heavily. Like, you don't even really need to have a deep knowledge of Superior to understand this. It's just like, okay, like it can be rewarding for a casual fan and also for someone who is like really deeply entrenched in the canon of these stories. It does leave some questions that I have. Like, again, I agree with you 100%. Like, it's a story gimmick, and it will be gone, and hopefully, like, that's it. You know, like, maybe there'll be a little play with it later on. Who knows? But like, I think we got everything we could out of it here. You know, like, we don't need to revisit Superior in the pages of Wells' run. Although I know we're getting more Superior comics. Which is a whole other conversation that you and I might have to have, given that that's how we started our show. But, you know, it was just hung around just long enough to be sweet and fun. I do have some questions still about the logistics of the arms. Like, here the arms are driving Peter to kill Otto, potentially. But then, like, a couple issues ago, they were the ones that went rogue and sabotaged Norman's base, you know, for Otto.
Yep.
So it's like maybe that was driven just by a hatred of Norman rather than any love for Otto. But it does seem to be a bit inconsistent as a plot device.
Yeah.
And really just to function as that rather than like a fully formed and intrinsically motivated character. So it's fun, and that is just a nitpick. So I thought this was a blast.
Yeah, and frankly, I was getting a little confused even when the Octoids started to kind of turn against Otto and favor Peter for a bit. I mean, I guess I kind of understand it, but to your point, it felt a little incongruous in terms of what the exact status quo was with all these things. But yeah, I mean, kind of free your mind a little bit, and you can still have some fun with it.
Yeah, and I really like the moment of Spider-Man wanting to save the arms when they tried to sacrifice themselves. You know, it would have been nice to see Spider-Man just get a clean win, but I do think it reinforces, like we said earlier, the themes of the book, like especially the difference between how Spider-Man and Otto treat their arms, right? Like, Otto is ready to sacrifice the arms, you know, in order to win the day, where Spider-Man won't. And I think, you know, a good, clean hero villain moment is nice in moments like that. So I appreciated, again, that kind of clear distinguishing line, even though Spider-Man's brain is being taken over by, you know, Otto's arms, his goodness as a person can still overcome, and he's not tempted to continue wielding that power, you know, indefinitely. So just good, clean hero versus villain stuff, and it's the kind of thing I think this book needs more of. You know, when they start getting into the mores of, like, you know, the complications of, like, editorial and big grand hooks, it's, I think, a lot less fun than just good, clean, like, this is a bad guy, this is a good guy, and
watch them do stuff.
There's trickery inside of that, like the Tombstone thing, but that doesn't need to be in every story. So
no, definitely not. And you can, like you said, you could be creative within the certain tropes that we have established, or you could just leverage and ride those tropes and have some fun with them. And I feel that's what we did here. Speaking of fun, like, Ed McGuinness is just, I mean, it's beautiful art, but it's also, like, it's fun art. Like, you know, I know I said this, I think, in the last episode, but I really do kind of, like, want to rescind some of my earlier criticisms of what the stories have been like with him, you know, on pencils. Because, like, these books have sung, man. These are great stuff. And, like, the splash pages, I mean, like, everything about it's clicking when it comes to the visuals here.
I just think it's the right balance. He finally had the right story to utilize his skills. You know, Otto is wonderfully expressive. These big pages, the jokes are set up really well, and it fits within the themes of the title. And, you know, I think that whiplash really didn't serve him well, because we kind of took it out on the art. And I just don't think that, like, we were given that ammunition in the story, because it just worked, and they were really singing as a team. And I'm okay with people taking a little bit of time to figure out how they work together.
Yeah.
You know, and I think this was the right balance between the two. And now I am really looking forward to what they do next, which seems to be a Limbo story. And as much as I'm not eager to get back to the Limbo stuff after Dark Web, like, maybe they'll find a way to make it work this time and get me invested in all of that. I thought that the best stuff in this was the comedy, the dolt pages of the setup of that, and like, the mirror image of Peter and Otto both shouting with the jagged line between them to that double page splash. Whether that was the writer laying that out or Ed, laying that on the page that way. I just think like his layouts in this book, swishing between the arms and keeping all of that coherent, I think about something like, as much as I love Humberto Ramos, I think about like the way he would draw like Otto operating with all the arms, and it would often get lost in these cluttered pages. And these are busy pages that are always clean and easy to read. And so I think he makes it look a lot easier than it is.
Okay. I agree. I think we're, like you said, we're just having some good, clean visual fun here, man. And I don't think I have anything else to add to this front. Do you want to get into grades?
Yeah, let's do it. I'm going to give this one a B+.
I'm just a slight nudge below you. I'm a B. I would say I'm a high B, which would make people say, well, why don't you just say B+? But I'm going to say, I'm like, no, I'm not a B+, I'm a B, but it's a high B.
Before you write your emails, it's a high B, not a B+.
It's
so
like
let's be clear.
Yeah, on a numerical scale, it's like an 86.8.
Okay, that's really specific. Alex, our video editor, make sure you include that specificity
there you go.
When you put it up on screen, because we want to be very clear for those who are keeping record of all of this stuff.
Exactly. Thank you for keeping things sacrosanct here, Dan.
I wouldn't have it any other way, Mark. I'm looking out for you. I'm looking out for your mentions.
Unlike on what platforms? I'm not on any of them anymore. On Instagram.
What about on X, Mark?
Yeah.
No. Anyway.
All right.
Mark, why don't you take us home?
Yeah. Well, speaking of X, it's that time for all good things to come to an end. So we want to say thank you to you, the listeners and viewers, for tuning in to this episode of the Amazing Spider Talk.
Yeah, this podcast exists because of our listener support on Patreon. For only $3.99 a month, you can help support our show's existence while getting early episodes, including these reviews the same week the comics release, exclusive artwork, and a ton of other bonuses. So a special thank you to everyone who already supports us and the work that we do. But we have no new patrons this week. It's the first time in months that we've been able to say that. So, thanks to everybody who's supporting us. But if you are on the fence about joining our Patreon, you can help us correct this one minor ding in our otherwise sterling record of increased growth, because capitalism, by checking out our Patreon.
To think, maybe it's because I'm not on X causing fights anymore, Dan. We're not getting Patreon members.
No.
All right. Anyway, well, to download our earliest episodes, including interviews with legendary creators like Jay and DeMatteis, Tom DeFalco, Mark Bagley, Ron Frenz, David Michelini, and many, many more, subscribe to our Amazing Spider Talk Back Issues podcast on Apple Podcasts.
So, Mark, now that we've shared our minds, bodies, and melded our spines into our podcasting equipment, what's our motto?
With great podcasts, there must also come the Amazing Spider Talk. You don't